So at this point, it's my huge pleasure to welcome again Lord Mark Price. If anyone's unfamiliar with Mark's CV, I'll give a very quick summary. So Mark started with the John Lewis Partnership after graduation and became a member of the Waitrose board in 1997. For those of you unfamiliar with the UK retail market, Waitrose is a part of the John Lewis Partnership. Mark was appointed MD of Waitrose in 2007. And then in 2016, having been appointed a life peer, the then Lord Price retired from the John Lewis Partnership and was appointed Minister of State for Trade and Investment in February 2016 by the then Prime Minister, David Cameron. He was subsequently reappointed twice by Theresa May as Minister for State for Trade Policy, and he then stepped down from the government in September 2017 to pursue his writing and business interests. As a successful businessman, writer, and former government minister, Mark has an unrivaled knowledge and experience of what it takes to get to the top and stay there. He is passionate about creating engaged and happy workforces who in turn create longer-term sustainable success for their businesses. So Mark, many thanks again for agreeing to share your expertise with us. I'll hand over to you.
Good morning, everybody. And Gary, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And what I'd like to do this morning is to talk to you about happiness at work, which may seem an odd thing to talk about, but hopefully it'll become clearer. And also I want to share with you research on the workplace, which we've done this year, which I hope will go some way to answering the questions that I know that you've been looking to pose to me over the course of the last 45 minutes or so. So workplace happiness. So my introduction to workplace happiness came when I joined the John Lewis Partnership as a graduate trainee in 1982, which really is a lifetime ago. And I joined the organisation not because of its culture or what it stood for, but rather because it had 2 golf courses and 5 ocean-going yachts. And as a 21-year-old mad keen golfer, I thought this must be a good organisation to join. And when I joined, what I discovered is that the John Lewis Partnership had been established almost 100 years before I joined by a very forward-thinking man called John Speedham Lewis. And what he did was that he changed the nature of that business from being a family-owned business to being owned by all the people that worked in it. But what was most fascinating was not that in and of itself. It was the fact that what he said was that the supreme purpose of the John Lewis Partnership is the happiness of the people that work there. And this was written in the Constitution he wrote, and it was the supreme purpose. It was why the organisation existed. Now, I can remember going to business schools in the 1990s. I remember going to America, to Columbia, on a 2-week strategy course. It was probably about 94 I went. And when I was there, a lecturer came into the room. There were about 40 of us from all over the world sitting listening to this lecture. And the first thing he did was to write on the chalkboard, what is the supreme purpose of a chief executive? And hands shot up and people one by one started to say, the supreme purpose of a chief executive is maximizing shareholder value. That's why we're here, to make more money for our shareholders. And there was broad agreement. And I rather nervously, right at the end, put my hand up and I said, well, actually, I work for a company where the supreme purpose is the happiness of the people that work there. And that caused, as you might imagine, a huge debate for the next 2 weeks. And it's rather a chicken and an egg debate. How do you get to shareholder value? Now, increasingly, what you find is organizations talk about being customer-centric, that their true north or their North Star is looking after the customer. But the reality is you can't look after the customer unless you look after your people. And in many businesses, that seems to be a very odd notion. Richard Branson has always talked about having a people-first strategy. But in other businesses, it seems very, very difficult for management to comprehend that you start with the people. And yet, if you think about other spheres of work, it's seen as being completely natural. For football teams, they don't think about our supreme purpose is the happiness of our fans. What they want to do is look after their players. They want the best players and they want them to perform. Because of that, then the fans get the entertainment that they deserve. If you think about it in the context of the arts, if you're playing in an orchestra, you want the best possible musicians so that your audience can enjoy the best possible music. If you work in research, you want the best researchers to produce the best vaccine, so ultimately the customer gets the benefit. So in all kinds of spheres, we accept that the individual comes first. But in some areas of work, we've still not made that leap. And yet, if you look at all the evidence says that those organizations who have the happiest and the most engaged workforces are the most successful. So when I left the John Lewis Partnership in 2016, I wrote a book called Fairness for All. And what I did in that was to set out both in principle and in practice why and how you engage teams to achieve greater success. And there is now a wealth of academic evidence from all over the world. And what that evidence says is that profits are 20% higher in those organizations with engaged and happy workforces. Productivity is higher, waste is lower, staff turnover is lower, sick absence is lower, and earning per shares is higher. When I was running Waitrose, there was a very clear correlation between those shops that had the highest levels of engagement and happiness and their commercial success, and those that didn't. And it was always a lead indicator that where you have a team that are unhappy, it is highly likely that it will be inefficient and it won't be performing at its best. And so the first question I would always have is, are we measuring this? Are we measuring how happy our people are? We spend fortunes on measuring how happy our customers are and wanting feedback on our products and our customers, but how much time and energy comparatively are we putting into checking on how happy our people are? So what I decided to do when I wrote the book was to build 2 digital platforms. One, to measure how happy individuals were, and now hundreds of thousands of individuals all over the world have been to Workle, and what they've been able to do is to measure their happiness and improve it. But also I built a site for businesses, engaging business. We've now worked with over 100 companies, measuring, analysing and improving the engagement of the happiness of their people. But what I want to spend the next few minutes doing before I share with you what's happened in the world of work over the last year is to explain what happiness at work is. Because for me, having spent 30 odd years in an organisation where it's supreme purpose, it's not an ethereal thing. It's actually something that you can measure. And it's not about ping pong tables. It's not about beanbags, as nice as those things may be. It's not about pizza night on a Friday, as good as that may be. but it's about far more solid and measurable things. And in my experience, there are 6 things which drive happiness and engagement at work. The first is reward and recognition. It's about whether people feel that they are fairly paid. All the evidence says that if you are paid 5% more than you think you are worth, you do not get extra discretionary effort. But if you're paid 5% less than you think you're worth, it niggles at you all the time. Pay is a hygiene factor, and people need to make sure, or need to make sure they feel that they're fairly paid. Far more important is recognition. If you want to make a workforce happy, recognizing their achievements is more important in all the research that we have done than pay. And we are terrible at it in the UK. Recognition in the UK, we thank people for a job well done about once every 4.5 months. We criticise twice a week. So either implied criticism or actual criticism twice a week, praise once every 4 months. And that in itself, changing that dynamic, in my view, would improve workplace engagement and happiness. And I could tell you stories, but I haven't got time of all the things we did in Waitrose to try and make sure that we had instant ways of recognising good performance. The second is information. And of all these 6, I think information is the single most important, because what information is about is making sure that people have the information to do their job properly, so they feel equipped to do their job. But it's also having information about the context in which they're operating. How is this organisation doing? How is this business doing? How open is management at sharing this information with me so I understand my place in the world? And it's only by having information that you can have empowerment. And we've got lots of interesting data I'll come on to about how empowered people feel in the workplace over the course of the last year and how things might change. But empowerment is really making sure that people have responsibility so that they can care for something. If you own something, you care more. And therefore making people responsible for their decisions, their actions, their results leads to greater empowerment and leads to greater happiness and involvement at work. The fourth is well-being, and this has really come to the fore this year with COVID. And well-being is about 3 things. It's about, does this organisation care for my mental, my physical, and my financial well-being? And one of my favourite quotes is from Theodore Roosevelt. And he said, "Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care." Or simply put, if your organisation is not overtly looking as though it cares for you, then you're not likely to care for that organisation. The 5th is a sense of pride. And in the leadership group that I was in, a lot was said about the importance of pride or a sense of purpose, doing something that's worthwhile. And you'll all have heard the story about when President Kennedy visited NASA and the team was lined up for him to greet, and he went along the line and he got to this chap who was the cleaner, the janitor, and he asked him what he did. And he said, "I'm putting a man on the moon." And so finding a context for your people to operate so they understand how important their job is, not only within the organisation, but outside, leads to greater engagement and happiness. And the last is job satisfaction. And we measure 2 things principally in job satisfaction. The first is career development. Is this organisation developing me? Not just in terms of my work, but developing me as a person. Am I growing through being involved with this organisation? And the last and the single most important thing in job satisfaction is, what's my relationship like with my line manager? People leave organisations principally for 2 reasons. 1, they don't think they're being paid fairly, but more importantly, they don't have a good relationship with their line manager. Our research says that over 80% of people who leave because they cite a poor relationship with their line manager. So it's these things that we measure, both on an individual basis and with organisations. And what I want to do now is share with you the results from this last year. Every September, we publish an annual report, and that's based on all of our findings from all the surveys that are completed around the world. and we share this report. If any of you would like it, if you go to engaging.business, we're happy to send you a copy of this report. But it really is a year when I do believe, and again, this came out in the group that I was part of, that the workplace has changed and managers are going to have to think very differently about that. So here are the key themes. Here are the things that we've learned. The first thing is that actually, overall, people are much happier working from home and they're much happier post-COVID than pre-COVID. So the scores that we averaged in 2019, the overall happiness score was 58%. Pre-COVID, it had gone up to 64%, excuse me, but it's 72% now. So there's been a huge increase in workplace happiness. And that's pretty much because across all of those 6 dimensions, employees feel happier. There's 1 or 2 where they feel less happy, but on the whole, they feel happier. For most people, the kitchen table now trumps the office. They prefer working from home. And if you want to carry a stat away about how people are feeling, in a survey we did of over 20,000 people 4 months ago, 18% said that they want to go back to the office. They're desperate to go back to the office. And they're principally younger people. 20% said they do not want to go back to the office. And they're principally older people, 50 plus. But the majority, 66% of people, said what they now want is a degree of flexibility in their working arrangements. They want to do 2 or 3 days at home and 2 or 3 days in the office. I'll show you some stats about anxiety and depression and how people feel about that, but that's one area that's got worse in a COVID world. In terms of age groups, the unhappiest group are the younger group, 19 to 24, and then it's the next age group, 24 to 35. The happiest are the older workers. I'll give you some information on ethnicity, but Asian and British employees have become the happiest through this period, followed by white employees. Men have become happier than women. Last year and the year before, women scored themselves as being happier in the workplace. This year it's men, and I'll give you a few reasons why that scored the way it has. And all of a sudden, from nowhere, technology has seen the largest increase in workplace happiness. It's 87% pre-COVID. It was actually in the lower half of the 26 industries that we measure. If you look at happiness globally, we measure happiness as 134 different countries. I thought I'd give you a snapshot here. The United Kingdom actually did very well. We were 69% in terms of our score. Switzerland topped the pops, they were 75%. The USA much lower than us at 59%. You can see New Zealand and Australia. India did particularly well, but we've got a breakdown now of 134 countries and different scores in those countries. I said I'd touch on well-being, and what I really want to draw out here is the fact that if you look at well-being and all of our questions together, actually what we saw was an improvement in people talking about their well-being. We asked a number of questions to try and get at people's well-being, but there's one particular question we asked, which is about, do you feel anxious and depressed at work? And the sad news is that that's gone up. It was the one area of well-being. So although people are saying my working environment's better, the organization cares for me, I'm treated with respect, all of those things were good, but this one question that's aimed to get at people's mental health got worse across all groups. And that must be driven by the uncertainty of what's happening at the moment. And you'll all know that there was a drive pre-COVID to think more about well-being and mental health. And if anything, I would suggest that what has happened with COVID is it sped up the need for people to think more about, is this organisation doing a lot? And after diversity inclusion, at the moment, the most work we're doing is in this area of well-being, surveys and helping organisations improve the well-being of their people. Empowerment, again, it was mentioned in our group. People feel more empowered now than they did before. And the simple truth is that management has had to trust people. You can't look over somebody's shoulder. You have to give them a task to do. And so we've seen the happiness scores of empowerment go up by 8 percentage points to 68%. And this is pretty well all groups feeling empowered, which is very powerful. So people have been trusted and people have appreciated being trusted. And I don't think there's any going back from this. In the same way that there's a trend on mental health, there's now a trend on empowerment, that people having been given that responsibility are not going to likely want to give it back. In terms of age, I mentioned right at the start that the unhappiest groups were the younger groups. We saw happiness improve across all groups. The average was 8%. The younger group went up by 5%. The happiest group at work are those who are age 50 something plus. So when you're looking at your workforce, you're getting very different stories from different groups, whether they're management, whether they're old, whether they're young, whether they're women, whether they're men, whether they're from an ethnic minority. And I would suggest that one of the great dangers is looking at a workforce as a homogeneous mass and just saying, this is the average for this group. If you've got your head in the oven and your feet in the fridge, you're an average temperature, but actually you're in massive distress. The same is true when you look at data around your workforce. What you will find is there are huge differences now between what different groups are looking for from their workplace, whether they want home working, whether they want more career development, etc., etc. Ethnicity. So the lowest scoring ethnic group were Black respondents at 64%, Asian group were the highest at nearly 70%, and then white. And within the data, what we do find is there are high points. So as I put on the slide here, Black men reported positively, then they're asked if they had the right resource to do their job well, but they feel least trusted and they enjoy their job least than males of other ethnicity. And then we talk a lot about how white women are feeling at work and how they compare to their other ethnicities. And also, I think the key thing to draw out here is that if you look at age, it has a huge bearing. So if any of you are interested in ethnicity and D&I, thinking about it cut across male, female, age, what you find is a whole host of different responses. What we've found, and I'm sure what you're finding in your organizations, is that there is a much greater focus from businesses now on ethnicity after the horrendous George Floyd murder or killing and all that flowed from Black Lives Matters. And so we're doing more and more work in this space to try and understand how different groups feel in the workplace. And when we look at diversity, we don't just look at ethnicity, we look at disability, we look at things like sexual orientation, a whole range of things to try and help businesses better understand how groups of their workplace are feeling. So if there's been a change, I think, that's been pushed forward over the course of the last year, in addition to COVID and well-being, it's this whole theme around ethnicity and diversity within the workforce. And I don't think that's going to change. Gender, I already talked about. Men have increased significantly this year in terms of their happiness of work. Women went up, but not by as much. Why? All of the qualitative research says that women with caring responsibilities, children, etc., have felt that their working lives have been compromised. To have to try and do a job and to juggle all of those things when they're at home has been extraordinarily difficult. And so if you're thinking about home working going forward, and I'm sure you are, there are very different requirements from men and women, those that are carers and those that are not carers. So understanding that in some degree of granularity is really important to have different and flexible strategies for different groups. You might not be surprised to hear that management were happier at the end of COVID. Their score went up by 9 percentage points, particularly managers feeling empowered. There's one thing I would draw out on management though, which is a point around information sharing. So one of the things that was I think, quite challenging in these numbers is that if you are a non-manager, you felt better trained to do your job than if you were a manager. So when we ask the question about, do you feel that you have the information you need to do your job well, non-managers scored higher than managers. And I think there is something now about how are we equipping managers to manage in this more volatile and changing, ever-changing, rapidly changing world, because they felt less equipped. But when we ask the question, is information openly shared with you about your business, managers scored much more highly than non-managers. So there's something about information not cascading down businesses. It's getting to middle management, and then it's not getting down to the people who work in the organizations. So on this issue of management and information, I would say that businesses generally have two issues they could look at. One, are the cascades working effectively? And the second is, are management feeling properly supported in coping with the amount of change that's going on at the moment? The other interesting thing I draw out here is that for every age group, managers are happier than non-managers, apart from people aged 29 and under. If you are in that group, you're actually scoring that you're happier if you're a non-manager than if you're a manager. So if you were going to focus attention, thinking about that younger age group and how they're equipped is hugely important. I've mentioned industries, I'm not going to dwell on it. Technology has done the best. Not surprisingly, hospitality and retail were towards the bottom, given the disruption in those industries. We've got rankings for all 26 industries. If you go to workall.co, you can actually find the happiest companies to work in. We've now got over 10,000 companies that are ranked in the UK, but also you'll find the industries that are happiest to work in. So there's a lot of work that we've done about which industries are happiest and least happy and how they might improve. And I want to finish with just 2 slides, and then I'd be delighted to take any questions. When individuals finish the survey, we give them 9 different matrices to measure themselves against people that look like them. We've got matrices on inclusiveness and on well-being, a whole host of other things. But there's 2 I wanted to share with you, because I think that what they talk to is a problem that's building up and is going to keep building. When we measure the stickiness of people, what we're talking about is how likely are people to either stay in their job or move on from their job. And when we work with businesses, we look at the different cohorts and we can see who's most likely to go and stay. Now, if you look at the figures from pre and post coronavirus on the stickiness index, what you'll find is those that are most enthusiastic about staying have gone up from about 18% to 23%. So people do think that businesses are doing a good job. They've looked after them well through COVID. The absolute exiteers, so this is the category, and there are 5 categories in total, but I've just pulled 3 out. The absolute exiteers, those that are determined to go, have dropped from 6% to just below 2%. But if you look at that middle group, these are people that are apathetic. They don't really like their job. They're not sort of bothered about it either way. They don't feel moved to leave, and they kind of are okay where they are. That's gone from 37% to 49%. So half the workforce. And this survey, I think that in this survey there were, I think 93,000 respondents. So of those, half are basically saying that we'll kind of stick with it. They don't feel particularly engaged. And that must be a huge potential for any organisation to identify that group and try to do more to engage them. And then similarly, we had something we call the anarchist index. These are people who are either going to talk positively about your business, this is the best company I've ever worked for in my life, and those who are going to go down the pub and say, you know what, they're a complete shower and I would never work there ever, and I wouldn't advise anybody else to. Now, what's interesting with this is you get the same effect as the stickiness index. Those that are apostles and are saying, you know what, my company could not have been kinder, more generous, more understanding through COVID, and I would thoroughly recommend working there, has gone from 21 to 29%. Absolute anarchists, those saying these lot are useless, has gone down from 13 to just under 5%. And again, this speaks to the great job that businesses have done through COVID in supporting the workforce. because let's face it, the workforce has become the central focus of virtually every business because of the issues that we've already discussed. But look at the indifference. Those amount of people who are going to neither say they're great or they're terrible. They sit in the middle and they're not particularly engaged, and that's gone up to 42%. Now, my guess is, as we sadly see unemployment rise, and it will rise, more and more people are going to start falling into this group, because what they're going to say is, I'm being paid, I'd rather get my head down and get on with it, and let's see where we are in a year or two. So for businesses today, organizations today, I think understanding what that group looks like and doing all that you can to better engage them through the 6 things that I've talked about will drive improved performance. So I think I've probably talked for about 20 or odd minutes. Thank you very much for watching. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully, although terribly for you, I'm going to pop back up again in full life. There you go.
Fantastic, Mark. That was absolutely fascinating. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to kick off with the questions that were curated in the dialogue. So I will go around the groups. But if anyone thinks of any other questions they'd like to ask, just start popping them into the chat and we'll start to get to them as soon as we can. So I think I'm hoping that the 4iforum facilitators have identified the question askers. So maybe we'll start with Paul in the leadership room. What was one of the killer questions that?
Well, I'd like to ask Matthew Samuel Camps to bring his question around retaining and enhancing culture. Matthew, could you just articulate that for us?
Thank you, Paul. Mark, thank you very much for your earlier presentation. As I mentioned to our session, we achieved gold IIP status earlier this year, of which we're very, very proud. And I think one of the concerns that I've got as the managing partner of a business of 160 now spread over 8 locations is very much around retaining and enhancing the fantastic culture we've got in our business, particularly when we are now subject to a dispersed workforce. Having said that, I'm in one of our offices today and we're full up, COVID compliant, of course. But very much take on board the comments that have been made earlier on that people will not be in the office 5 days a week, and the levels of flexibility that we're already seeing ourselves and from our clients that we work with are indicating that something around 2-3 days a week in the office is likely to become the norm moving forward.
So your question is being in the office likely to become the culture, or how do you achieve it?
I think one of the challenges we've got is that we're all on a Zoom call today. It's very easy to hide behind Zoom. If you're not necessarily eyeballing your staff, you don't pick up the nuances of whether they're having a good day, a bad day, or perpetually a bad day, or perpetually a good day. It's that lack of personal interaction that we're forced into at the moment, which I think is, there is a danger that it can lead to an erosion of a very strong collegiate culture within a business.
Well, first, congratulations on your gold II.
That's very kind of you, thank you.
Great achievement. So for questions like this, I always start with what is culture? And the best quote I ever heard was that culture is the sediment of past transactions. And it's very difficult to build it. It's very easy to destroy it. And I think that you will have in your organization, given the great work you've done, a lot of goodwill, because people have seen the way you behave and what you believe in. I do agree with you about when you have all of those incidental chats in the corridor, they're great ways of being able to listen. How do you have those in a remote world? And I do think that's one of the downsides. What our research has said is that there are 3 big downsides that people recorded over the last year. The first for some is their home working environment. It's very nice if you've got an office and a desk and whatever. A lot of young people are working in bedrooms and bedsits and wherever. And, that's not easy. Some people find it difficult to find a conducive space to work in. That's a big issue, how we resolve that going forward. You've got another big issue with young people with career development. What they're saying is, I feel my career's on hold. I don't have informal or formal meetings anymore with my managers. I find it very difficult to go on training courses. Obviously, people now are turning to more online training, but there's a whole thing about career progression that people are worrying about. And the last thing, and really this is to your point, there's a really big issue around sociability. And again, it tends to be with the younger group. One of the reasons I like going to work is I like going out with my colleagues in the evening, or I like having, a laugh at lunchtime or whatever it happens to be. So I don't think that we should pretend that everything is rosy, although overall there has been an increase in happiness and people have adapted well, and the majority of people want to live in this half and half world going forward. There are issues with it. And therefore, I think that the most creative managers are going to think around, what do we do about career development? How do we change what we're doing to adapt to this kind of in and out and remote world? How do we support people with better working environments? If they can't work from home for any reason, is there somewhere locally where we can support them working? Is there a library, etc.? How can we think creatively about doing that? And the last thing is the sociable side of work. And I think that's, the hardest. I'm sure you've all, like me, been on, Zoom drinks, etc. It's not the same. And therefore, I talk to a lot of companies now who are thinking about, how do we reinvent the 2 or 3 days you are in work? Do we make them around training? Do we make them about information sharing? Do we make them about being more sociable as a group? And then when you go home, it's, head down, plow on with it. You've also got to remember that a lot of people don't work in offices. And for them, they've still got to go into work and do the things that they do. I mean, people working in supermarkets or construction sites. So for them, the world we're talking about doesn't have the same resonance, and you need to have a whole different set of thinking really about how you manage those people.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, well, let's move on to a question maybe from the people room, Steve. So can you highlight one of the key questions from Mark from that?
Yeah, I'm going to hand over to Louisa from our group, who has a question for you, Mark.
Hey, Mark. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really informative and interesting. And I think it did touch on some of the things that we had previously discussed in our session. So it was good to sort of get the data and the answers behind that. One of the things that we were talking about were the positive aspects of the pandemic. And our question to you is, how do we take these positive aspects and ensure that they continue for the future?
Thank you, Louisa. Well, in a way, I don't think we're going to have a choice. If you're listening to the workforce, they're going to be pretty straightforward going forward. One of the things we have on Workall is jobs in the happiest places to work in. And one of the filters we now have is remote working. Are you happy to have somebody working remotely? And what we're finding is that more and more people are clicking on that. They feel that they want to move to a job which gives that flexibility. So, historically, we've always changed benefits around work to try and bring the best talent to our businesses. And therefore, I think this shift is going to mean that HR managers, directors are going to have to think about, if we want to retain the best talent, if we want to recruit the best talent, we are going to have to change the way that we're thinking. Otherwise, I do think that people will go. So the genie's out of the bottle. I think if we'd had home working for a month, it would have maybe been a flash in the pan. I think that because people have been doing it now for 9 months, everybody's got used to it. So expectations have changed. So that's why I started what I was saying by saying the world of work has changed forever. We've created a new culture. We've created new routines and new ways of working. And for a lot of people, they like them and they're not going to want to step back. There are benefits for businesses as well, which we shouldn't forget. Again, our research is really clear on this. Organisations are saying, look, there's potentially large savings here in terms of accommodation costs in offices. and the amount of space that we actually need. We just need to repurpose it. There are real disputes over productivity. In terms of the length of time people are working, they are working more from home. On average, it's 43 minutes. So people are putting more work in at home because they're in a way finding it harder to manage the boundaries, but also they're happier to do it. There's trade-off for them. I'm not commuting, I'm saving a lot of money, I'm happy to finish whatever task it is. Managers need to be really clever about how they manage that and really sensitive to the individual, but there are certainly on paper benefits in terms of productivity. They're arguably outweighed by the lack of productivity you get from the creative spark when two people meet and say, you're doing it that way, I'm doing it this way, tell me why you're doing it, let's change and we can be better. But in terms of hours put in, it's more. So for all of those reasons, I think for both businesses and individual, there's now a desire to want to keep the changes we've got. Some will go back, but I just don't think we're going to go back. I think the last bit of evidence that I would give you is that if you look at the statistics for home working, they've been increasing slowly over the course of the last 5 years particularly. And so we were getting, at any one time in a year, about 25% of the workforce saying they were working from home. But really there was a hard core of about 7 or 8% working from home. So and that had been increasing year on year on year by about a percentage point. All of a sudden, we've now got a huge proportion of the workforce, arguably 40, 45% of the workforce at home. You're not going to go back from 45 to 5. So it will find a level somewhere between the both. But it means, as in the group I was in, Hannah from the NHS talking was saying, you are going to have to think about how your workforce is structured, your expectations of them, what they're doing, when they're doing it, greater flexibility. So I think that the pressure is on HR directors, HR managers, in a way now that it's not been before. People have gone to the top of every agenda. And it's the analogy I gave about football. All of a sudden, you realise that your people are the stars, and if they're not performing, then you can't hope to give good service to any of your customers, whoever your customers might be.
Thanks, Mark. Great question, Louisa. Okay, so Carrie, maybe a question from the organisation discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to invite Robin Chafe to ask his question, please.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. Back in March, April, we were all noticing how much birdsong there was and how blue the skies were. So our question is, how do we harness the environmental and sustainable benefits we noticed back then and maintain these as we move to the new normal?
Well, that's a really hard question to answer in the sense that it's arguable that a lot of that came because planes weren't flying and cars weren't driving. I don't think that we will go back to the kind of inactivity we had in terms of motoring and travel and air travel. However, I do think that these kinds of meetings will become more the norm now. I think people will question more how they use their time. I always found when I ran Waitrose that you would do research and people would say, yes, I want to, buy more ethical food. The reality was that they didn't do it. More people said they'd do it than actually did it. And it's a bit the same with climate change. And what you have to have is all of a sudden a moment where both personal interest and societal interest collide, and all of a sudden you get the change you want to see. And in a way, I think that that's what we've seen now through COVID. We've seen people say, I mean, last year I went to give a speech in Australia. I mean, I can't believe I did it now. I flew to Australia, I was there for 2 days and I flew home. Now, I wouldn't even entertain that. I would say, look, there's no reason why I can't do a speech perfectly effectively over Zoom. And I think for business meetings, we'll all start thinking the same. We'll think about our time, because the most precious thing we all have is our time. And somebody once said to me, after your love, the most precious thing you can give is your labor. And I think that your labor and your time are the most precious things that you control. And therefore, I think that one of the byproducts of COVID is we're all going to be far more conscious about, are we spending time traveling? Do we need to spend time traveling? how do we become more effective? And I think that will have a knock-on. I could talk about the environment for ages, given my background in Waitrose and as a trade minister, but I won't. All I would say is that I think that the UK government certainly is very aware of the fact that it has to have a green agenda and that, you know, things need to change. I hope with a new administration in America, they similarly re-engage, because I think that when you have political will, business will, and individual will combined, then you can get really effective change.
Great, really good question though, Robin. So James, maybe a quick question from the technology stream.
Sure, Harry, thanks very much.
Lord Price, excellent presentation, very interesting, and not always the case, well backed up with data, which I'm pleased to see. So my question is this, from a technology perspective: how do we avoid companies deploying technology post-COVID, which they think is good for the business, for example, cutting out costs to improve profitability, but is in fact not necessarily good for their employees?
It's a really good question, Harry, because it goes to the heart of how a business feels it generates the greatest amount of profit. And at the start of my talk, I talked about going to business school and the competing arguments for the most important group here are shareholders, and we need to make lots of profit for them at any cost. No, our fundamental focus is on our customer and looking after our customer. And then the last group, which I'm very much in, which is if you take care of your people, everybody else benefits. So I think that to achieve what you're saying, you need that cultural shift where a management team says, actually, if we're going to achieve the most, we've got to make sure that the workforce is engaged and agrees with this and we benefit. So if you were going to introduce something in that model, you would share it first of all with your employees. You would say, look, we're building this new tech or we're building this new approach and process. We want to involve you at an early stage to make sure that it's right. I can remember at Waitrose, we introduced some new fruit and veg fixturing. And what we did is we built it so that the green trays that the fruit and veg came in could be slotted straight into the shelving. And we saw the designs and we had all kinds of people in. And then we deployed it in a few trial shops. And when we deployed it, the feedback we got overwhelmingly particularly from women that worked in the section, was the trays are just too heavy to lift. They're too cumbersome. And so we had to stop. And what we actually did in the end was make the trays half the size and adapted the design. But if we'd have done that, we'd have had injuries at work. We'd have people saying, I don't want to work on this section. It's just too much like hard work. So if your approach is to listen and involve your workforce in making something that's better for the business and better for them, ultimately you get the best result. But that takes a fundamentally different approach from management. And without that, you're going to get, I'm afraid, Harry, a continuation of just do it because we'll make more money. But the sad effect of that is you'll have more sick absence, you'll have more anxiety at work, you'll have higher staff turnover, you'll require to spend more money on recruitment, more money on training, and in the end, you will not be as profitable.
Thank you. It's a great answer. And could I just make one ancillary point there? I've often seen in business, being a commercial person, arguments made around employee engagement and the workforce, and they're not made in a way that's compelling to the people whose focus in the business is commercial. And that's always struck me as strange, because if you look at, for example, if you look at metrics like human capital return on investment, beneath which are many metrics which you're talking about that measure the things that actually matter. If you look at that, it has an almost umbilical relationship to EBITDA. And if you look at most people who are running companies who have some skin in the game and therefore who are interested in the market value of the company, as I recall from my old days in university, if you're starting to calculate the market value of a company, EBITDA is where you start in the equation. So if you can explain to people who've run companies like yourself that in fact improving the factors that influence your return on investment in your workforce actually drives market value, then perhaps they'd listen a bit more keenly to those arguments.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's very well put, Harry. It is one of those things about inputs and outputs. And quite often what you find is the management measure the outputs, they're not measuring the inputs. So one of the things that, I think I said this at the start, when it comes to data, what data are you making decisions on? You're probably making them on the margin that you're making, or the number of customers you've got, or what your customers may think. I was very keen that in all the Waitrose board papers, the first matrix we look at is what's our staff turnover, what are our sickness levels, how are our people feeling? We had a whole host of qualitative and quantitative ways to do that. Because if we got that right, I was pretty convinced the rest would follow. And you make that the focus of the organisation. But the thing I'm really pleased to say is that more businesses and organisations are doing that. It becomes less about, show me the P&L and show me the component parts. It's more about what are the things that are driving this. And every part of it, whether it's innovate, where does innovation come from? It comes from your people. How committed are they? How involved are they? How well trained are they? How informed are they? All the things that I've talked about, whether you're talking about innovation or manufacturing or customer service industries, they all benefit from that approach.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Harry. Great question. So I'm going to go back to the leadership group for one more question, and then I'm going to open up to the ones that are in the chat. So, Paul, one final question from your.
Torn between two tough questions here, but perhaps the second question about lazy assumptions and looking at ourselves as leaders might be a lead-in for you, Gary, to our next symposium. So I'm going to go to the other question, which is no lesser. So if Amber could ask her, I was particularly struck by this phrase, which I'd not heard before, about being voice enabled. Amber, could we just articulate that question?
So thank you, Paul. Hi again, everyone, and Mark. So for me, I think going forward, if we're thinking about the leaders of the future and the leaders that we need, I think there was a great discussion in our group about holding the mirror up and a challenge around, have we got the right leaders? But actually, I think there's something about how leaders then, how we help leaders and we give them the benefit of the doubt and we support them, but how we help leaders really enable the voice of the organisation. So I suppose the question to you, Mark, and you've touched on this and a few other people have touched on it, around potentially the fragmented workplace that we're going to see of the future, where, we could have us and them. How do we create this employee voice that really is enabled in the workforce to engage our people and really hear what they're saying?
Thank you, Amber. So there are a number of ways that I've seen it done. So from my time in the John Lewis Partnership, it starts with every individual being willing and able to answer any question that any colleague has. So if I was in Waitrose and I went to one of our shops and somebody said to me, what are our plans for X? I would stop and I would tell them. Now, in the case of the John Lewis Partnership, it's because everybody in the business is an owner, the shares are held in trust. But in any business, if you have that mentality that you start with answering people's questions and that you welcome the questions as a way of sharing information, that's the very first thing you can do. And then you can have a whole host of informal channels. And you've got to combine, in my view, sharing information with listening to feedback. So my first question would be, what information are you sharing in order to get feedback? And how do you do that? Again, during my time at Waitrose, I would share board minutes with the 80,000 people that worked in Waitrose. We'd publish them every week in an abridged version, because I wanted everybody to know what the board was talking about. What were our priorities as a business? And I mean, obviously we didn't put, the secret and sensitive stuff in there, but we were able to give a feel for where we were going. And then there'd be weekly meetings in branches. We'd have forums where people from all over the business came together to ask questions and get information about sharing. So there were lots of ways, either through journalism or fact sheets or whatever. But it's that two-way thing, which you know really well from your brilliant work at the post office, Amber, that, the first of all, you've got to give people information so that they're informed and empowered. Once you've done that, then you think about, how do I want to take feedback on this to improve the organisation? Those things go hand in hand.
Great answer.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up a couple of quick questions from the chat. So Mike Sharples, could you maybe just ask your question around happiness and motivation?
Thank you very much. Mark, you talked a lot about happiness, and I do a lot of work on motivation. So I just wondered what you thought the connection between the two is.
So I think there are probably, you're the expert here, I should be asking you. So top of my head, I would say there are two ways you can motivate people. You can motivate them through fear. If you don't do this really well, you're going to lose your job. Or you can motivate them through engagement. If you do this really well, you're helping the company, I can reward you more, I can tell you what a great job you're doing. I've always felt that the second way is best. So when people talk to me about happiness at work and the figures, some people will challenge those figures and they'll say, look, we don't believe it. There cannot be any improvement. To which my response is always, well, what do you want? An unhappy workforce or an happy workforce? If you think there's no difference in your commercial results between the two, but all the evidence says there is a reward. I think that you can drive short-term performance through motivating people through fear and brutality. And you know what? There may be occasions when, for whatever reason, some people think that's the right thing to do. But if you want long-lasting, beneficial motivation improvement, I think that for me, it's the things that I talked about. It's, do people feel fairly rewarded and recognised? Do they feel they're making a real contribution to the organisation? Do they feel trusted, respected? Do they feel empowered? Do they feel that you really care for them? Do they feel they're doing something worthwhile? Do they feel that they're being developed so that every day they're getting better and stronger as an individual, not just in terms of their work, but in terms of their whole life? Do they have good relationships with the people around them? So, so it's those things, excuse me, that I think lead to really powerful motivation in the context that I'm talking about. But what about for you?
Yeah, I think those things are true. I'm thinking really about making that connection between sort of motivation and someone's sort of drive and energy, really. And what we find is that people, if they're highly motivated and they feel that their motivations are kind of being met by the organisation, they also have a lot more resilience to deal with some of the issues and challenges that come up, which obviously impacts then on their well-being and their happiness. So I see the two sort of fairly closely going hand in hand. And certainly we don't advocate motivating by fear, but tapping into what motivates individuals so that they feel more empowered and that their motivations are aligned with the organisation.
Yeah, I'd agree. I agree.
Terrific answer. Again, I'm sure we could spend all day. I'm sure Mark doesn't want to spend all day, but I'm sure we could spend all day on this fascinating subject. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring the conversation to a close. So first off, a massive thank you to everyone that made it along today. Everyone's contribution is important to us, and we will capture some of these questions, and I'm sure we're trying to find another time to explore them if we didn't quite get them to them today. So the interaction was fabulous, great questions. Really appreciate everyone taking the time. Of course, thanks, Mark. An absolute masterclass in how to relay not only how you're thinking, but also some of the data that underlies it. So massive round of applause, I think, from everyone in a virtual or silent way, how these things are done these days. Thank you for that. And I think it was an honor to hear from such a thought leader on this subject that is such a challenge for everyone. I'd also like to say again a big thank you to our sponsors, Etihad Aviation Group, and I'm just going to ask maybe Andrew if you could just maybe say a few words about why Etihad chose to get involved with the 4iforum.
Can I just say, first of all, thank you very much to Mark. It was just inspirational listening to you speak, Mark. So thank you for spending the time with us today. Yeah, I suppose we have a fairly clear strategy around the way with our direction. I suppose the first piece really is it's quite interesting listening to Mark, but it's all about enabling our team members to feel confident asking questions. So that's always been sort of like, front and center. When we actually asked them, it was all about how they prefer to kind of learn and grow with us. One of those was the ability to ask questions. This kind of fitted beautifully for us. There's this piece around coaching and mentoring. there's this piece around just being able to, like, to really think creatively. So that's that. I hope that answers your question. I think it's been a very, very good investment, if I'm honest, Gary.
I say thanks, Andrew. Really appreciate it. As I say, really appreciate your support, and really looking forward to working with you and the team going forward. So finally, a really big thank you to everyone in the 4i team that made this event possible, to Emma, who's put together all these fantastic videos and backdrops. Thanks to Steve, Carrie, James, Paul for their leadership in the dialogues. If your company would like to become a patron, please reach out to any of us. You can connect with us on LinkedIn. You can go to our website, www.4iforum.com, or email us at patrons@4iforum. There's also the opportunity to donate to us. We are looking for people to continue to support our work. As our video showed at the start, we're hoping to give away 1 million free seats at our forums to anyone that's interested. All of our delivery is free to anyone that wants to come. Our next 4i forum is on the 17th of December. It's around neurodiversity and social behaviours. So if you can make it along to that, please do so. I've put some links in the chat about how you can continue to engage with us. There is also some QR codes that Em's put up. So if you want to take a quick picture, that will also highlight some of our events and also how to continue to get engaged with us as an organisation. If you particularly enjoyed today, please share with others on LinkedIn and other social media platforms of your choice. We also have a number of forums lined up in January. I'm hoping we can just quickly show the list, but we've got things like strength-based leadership, strategy reimagined, unlocking staff motivation. I think we talked about that today. We're even going to have a session about the new world order in a post-Trumpian universe. And we've also got a session lined up on innovation as well. Our next symposium is scheduled for March. We have Simon Lancaster, one of the world's leading speech writers, talking about the language of leadership. Stay tuned to our LinkedIn page or our newsletters to stay abreast of that particular event. And just as we finish off, we're going to show one final video for those who can make it. Thanks again to Mark. Brilliant talk. Thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully we've given you a taste of what 4i Forum is all about, what we are here for, and the difference we're trying to make.
Is this something you might like to be part of? Would you like to help others as you help yourself?
We make it really easy to give to 4i Forum, and you get benefits straight away.
As an individual sponsor, you can give as little as £1 a month or as much as you choose to support the learning community.
Individual sponsors can join peer discussion forums, access digital resources, and previously recorded collaborative forums.
Your support contributes to providing free forum seats for those who need access to collective learning.
Our patrons are central to supporting this learning community. Without patrons, there are no forums and there's no sponsored seats for those that need them.
That could even be the leadership team from a critical company in your supply chain.
As a patron, you are guaranteed seats in the forums. And to become one, simply get in touch and we can tailor a package that meets both your learning and development and corporate social responsibility needs.
We believe that our economy will only be as strong as the weakest link. So if we help each other, we'll recover sooner, and everyone benefits from businesses succeeding. And collectively, we have knowledge and expertise that can help others. Thank you.